The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of amber and rust, but inside the climate-controlled briefing room at Nellie's Air Force Base, the atmosphere was Arctic. Major Cassandra Reaper Voss sat in the back row, her weathered flight jacket draped over the plastic chair like a discarded skin. She wasn't supposed to be here. Hell, she wasn't supposed to be anywhere near an active squadron anymore. The bureaucrats had made that crystal clear 6 months ago when they'd quietly shuffled her into a desk job, citing operational concerns and psychological evaluations, euphemisms that tasted like ash in her mouth. The briefing officer, a clean-shaven captain who looked like he'd never seen combat outside of a simulator, droned on about today's training exercise. Red Flag 24-3, they called it. A massive mock air battle designed to test the limits of America's finest pilots. F-22 Raptors would dance with F-35 Lightning IIs high above the desert floor, while F-16 Fighting Falcons provided close air support to ground units scattered across the range. It was supposed to be routine, predictable, safe. The kind of exercise that looked impressive in promotional videos, but rarely pushed anyone beyond their comfort zone. Reaper's fingers traced the worn leather of her flight gloves, muscle memory awakening pathways that 6 months of forced inactivity couldn't erase. She'd flown 127 combat missions over Afghanistan, each one etched into her soul like scar tissue. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Warthog, had been her sanctuary, her weapon, her salvation. The twin-engine beast wasn't pretty like the sleek fighters that dominated the modern Air Force. It was built for one purpose: to get low, get dirty, and bring everyone home alive, just like her. The captain's voice cut through her reverie. Observer aircraft will maintain minimum safe distance and provide real-time assessment of tactical effectiveness. His eyes found hers across the room, a mixture of pity and condescension that made her jaw clench. Observer aircraft. That's what she'd become, a passenger in her own sky. But as the pilots filed out toward their aircraft, chattering about vectors and engagement zones, Reaper felt something stir in her chest. It had been quiet for months, that predatory instinct that had made her legendary among ground troops who'd watched her turn enemy positions into smoking craters. Today felt different. The desert wind carried whispers of change, and somewhere beyond the horizon, trouble was brewing. She could taste it in the dry air, could feel it in the way the morning light seemed too sharp, too focused. In 6 hours, when the sun reached its zenith and cast no shadows, everyone would understand why they called her Reaper. But for now, she was just a passenger, forgotten and dismissed, watching from the margins as younger pilots prepared to learn lessons she'd already paid for in blood. The hangar smelled of jet fuel and possibility as Reaper walked toward her assigned aircraft. Not her beloved A-10, that bird was grounded pending comprehensive maintenance review, but a backup Warthog that bore the scars of countless training exercises. She ran her hand along the titanium bathtub that formed the cockpit, feeling the subtle vibrations of the twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans spinning to life. This wasn't her bird, but it was close enough. The ground crew chief, Staff Sergeant Martinez, approached with a clipboard and a skeptical expression that had become all too familiar. "Major, you're cleared for observation flight profile only," Martinez said, his voice carefully neutral. "Command wants confirmation that you'll maintain minimum engagement distance and provide situation reports every 15 minutes. The unspoken message hung between them like exhaust fumes. Don't do anything stupid. Don't embarrass us. Don't be the pilot you used to be." Reaper accepted the clipboard and signed with practiced efficiency. Her signature looked different now, smaller, more constrained, as if even her handwriting had learned to apologize for existing. "Understood, Sergeant. Just along for the ride." The lie tasted bitter, but she'd grown accustomed to bitter things lately. As she completed her pre-flight inspection, fragments of conversation drifted from nearby aircraft. The F-16 pilots were young, confident, loaded with academic knowledge and simulator hours, but lacking the indefinable quality that only came from having someone actually try to kill you. She listened to their radio chatter, nodding the casual arrogance that had once been her own trademark. Call signs like Maverick and Thunder, names chosen to sound impressive rather than earned through blood and adrenaline. Reaper, this is Tower. You're cleared for taxi to runway 27. Maintain observer protocol throughout exercise duration. The voice belonged to Colonel Hayes, her former squadron commander who'd been conspicuously absent during her recent troubles. Politics, she knew. Career preservation. In the military, loyalty was a luxury few could afford when the bureaucrats came calling. The A-10's engines roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. This was the moment she lived for, when tons of metal and fury transformed into something approaching grace. The Warthog wasn't fast, wasn't pretty, but it was honest in a way that few things were anymore. It would fly low, absorb punishment that would obliterate lighter aircraft, and deliver devastating firepower precisely where it was needed. Just like her. As she taxied toward the runway, Reaper caught sight of her reflection in the cockpit glass. 34 years old, with crow's feet that spoke of squinting through desert glare and laugh lines earned in ready rooms around the world. Her dark hair was regulation length, pulled back in a way that revealed the small scar above her left temple, a souvenir from a hard landing in Kandahar province. She looked tired, older than her years, but her eyes still held the predatory focus that had made insurgents pray for cloudy days. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Reaper advanced the throttles with reverent precision. The desert floor fell away beneath her as the Warthog climbed into morning sky that stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of blue that had no names. 23,000 feet above the Nevada test and training range, the sky belonged to the hunters. 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the 64th Aggressor Squadron cut through the thin air like silver bullets, their pilots riding the edge between control and chaos. This was their element, the high-altitude dance where split-second decisions meant the difference between victory and simulated death. Call signs Viper, Blade, Phoenix, and Striker represented the best of a new generation, pilots who'd grown up with precision-guided munitions and satellite navigation, who understood war through high-definition displays and data links. Viper lead to all flights. We have multiple bandits bearing 270, range 40 miles and closing. Captain Jake, Viper. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with practiced authority. At 28, he was the youngest flight leader in squadron history, a fact that had earned him both admiration and resentment in equal measure. His F-16C carried the latest Block 50 upgrades, equipped with an APG-68 radar that could track targets beyond visual range and engage with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles that redefined the meaning of air superiority. 40 miles to the west, Reaper held her A-10 in a lazy orbit at 15,000 feet, officially observing the exercise while privately fighting the urge to dive toward the deck where her aircraft belonged. The Warthog felt sluggish at this altitude, like a predator forced to hunt in the wrong environment. She monitored multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, building a mental picture of the battle developing above her. The F-16s were good, she had to admit that. Their coordination was textbook perfect, their communications crisp and efficient. Phoenix, you're spiked, bearing 090, Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix, Kim's wingman warned, referring to the radar lock indication that meant enemy missiles were inbound. Kim's response was immediate and professional. Chaff and flare dispensers triggered, hard defensive turn to break the radar lock, altitude change to complicate the intercept geometry. She'd trained for this scenario hundreds of times, but training and reality wore different faces. The simulated missiles were actually high-tech pods that could calculate hit probability and transmit kill signals to target aircraft. When Phoenix's F-16 received the dreaded tone indicating a successful intercept, her voice remained steady despite the disappointment. "Phoenix is hit, RTB," she announced, beginning her return to base. 1 down, 3 remaining. Reaper watched the tactical display on her multifunction screen, noting how the remaining F-16s adjusted their formation to compensate for the loss. Good pilots, she thought. They understood the fundamentals. But fundamentals were lessons learned in peacetime, and peacetime had a way of teaching dangerous optimism about the nature of aerial combat. She'd learned different lessons in skis where mistakes meant body bags and folded flags. Blade, Striker, implement Cobra formation, Viper ordered, referring to a complex tactical maneuver designed to maximize mutual support while maintaining offensive capability. The two wingmen responded with mathematical precision, their F-16s sliding through the air like components of a well-oiled machine. This was modern air combat at its finest, clinical, efficient, overwhelming. But something nagged at the back of Reaper's mind as she watched the exercise unfold. The enemy aircraft were behaving too predictably, following established patterns that made sense in training scenarios but rarely survived contact with creative adversaries. Real combat was messier, more chaotic, filled with variables that couldn't be programmed into simulators or captured in doctrine manuals. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows on the desert floor 12,000 feet below. Soon, those shadows would disappear entirely, and with them, the illusion of safety that surrounded every training exercise. Reaper didn't know it yet, but 40 miles to the north, a classified reconnaissance drone was painting laser designators on targets that weren't supposed to exist. And somewhere in a bunker beneath Nellie's Air Force Base, senior officers were realizing that Red Flag 243 was about to become something altogether different. The first sign of trouble came as a whisper through encrypted channels, a fragment of radio traffic that shouldn't have existed during a routine training exercise. Reaper's ears, trained by years of listening for the subtle changes that preceded violence, caught it immediately. Unknown aircraft, bearing 180, not squawking. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by standard exercise chatter that seemed suddenly artificial by comparison. She switched to the emergency frequency and heard nothing but static. Protocol demanded that she report the anomaly to exercise control, but something deeper than protocol held her back. The sky felt different now, charged with potential energy like the moments before a lightning strike. Her A-10's radar warning receiver remained silent, but instincts honed by 127 combat missions were screaming warnings that had nothing to do with electronic sensors. 25 miles north of her position, Viper's flight was executing a perfect pincer movement against simulated enemy bombers when their world changed in an instant. Viper lead, this is magic, came a voice from an AWACS controller stationed far above the exercise area. The call sign meant this wasn't part of the training scenario. Be advised, we have multiple unknown contacts approaching your area of operations. Vector 090, Angels 25, speed 600 knots and increasing. Captain Morrison felt his stomach drop as the implications registered. Unknown contacts during a closed training exercise meant only one thing. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there had entered restricted airspace. That someone could be a lost civilian aircraft, a navigation error by military traffic, or something far more serious. His training took over, transforming confusion into action with mechanical efficiency. All Viper flights, abort current exercise. Vector 090, climb to Angels 30, weapons hot, he ordered, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Weapons hot meant their training missiles were now armed with live warheads, a transition that transformed a training exercise into something with deadly potential. The F-16s turned as one, their pilots' hearts racing as adrenaline-flooded systems that had been running on simulation mode moments before. Reaper heard the transmission and felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd been in enough real situations to recognize the subtle changes in radio discipline that preceded actual combat. The casual banter disappeared, replaced by clipped, professional communications that carried undertones of barely controlled tension. These pilots were about to face their first real engagement, and she was stuck on the sidelines like a spectator at someone else's war. "Control, this is Reaper requesting permission to climb to combat altitude," she transmitted, knowing the answer before the response came. "Negative Reaper. Maintain observer altitude and bearing. Continue mission as briefed." The voice belonged to some faceless controller who'd never felt the gut-wrenching terror of incoming missiles or watched friends disappear in balls of fire. Someone who thought war could be managed from a distance, like a video game with higher stakes. But as she watched the F-16s climb toward their destiny, Reaper made a decision that would define the next 6 hours. She didn't climb toward the approaching contacts. Instead, she did something that her training, her instincts, and her understanding of modern aerial warfare all told her was correct. She descended toward the deck, pushing the A-10's nose down until she was skimming 500 feet above the desert floor, low enough that radar returns would be confused by ground clutter, low enough that heat-seeking missiles would struggle to distinguish her engines from the sun-baked rocks below. The Warthog belonged down here in the weeds, where the air was thick and honest. If those F-16 pilots were about to fight for their lives, they'd need someone watching their backs. Someone who understood that the most important part of air-to-air combat wasn't shooting down enemies, it was making sure everyone came home. The desert floor rushed past at 450 knots, close enough to touch, close enough to kill. Reaper flew with practiced ease, her hands steady on the controls as she threaded between mesas and arroyos that would have challenged pilots half her age. This was where she belonged, down in the dirt and danger, where mistakes had immediate consequences and survival depended on skill rather than technology. Above her, the F-16s were about to learn the difference between training and terror, but they wouldn't learn it alone, not if she had anything to say about it. The unknown contacts materialized on radar screens across the Nevada test, range like digital ghosts resolving into terrifying reality. 8 aircraft flying in perfect formation, their electronic signatures matching no known civilian or military aircraft in the database. They approached from the northwest at Mach 1.2, maintaining radio silence while painting every F-16 in the area with targeting radar that felt like laser sights pressed against their souls. "Magic, this is Viper lead. Request immediate identification on bogies, over." Captain Morrison's voice carried the controlled tension of a man watching his world shift from exercise to emergency in real time. His F-16's radar warning receiver was lighting up like a Christmas tree, indicating multiple target locks from aircraft that weren't supposed to exist. The AWACS controller's response chilled him to the bone. "Viper lead, Magic. Bogies are not squawking friendly IFF. Repeat, unknown aircraft are not identifying as friendly. You are cleared to engage if fired upon. Rules of engagement are now weapons-free." Weapons-free. The phrase that transformed training pilots into combat veterans in the space of a heartbeat. Morrison felt his mouth go dry as the implications registered. Someone had violated U.S. airspace with military aircraft, someone who wasn't talking and wasn't identifying themselves. In the post-9/11 world, such behavior carried deadly implications. 500 feet above the desert floor, Reaper heard the radio chatter and felt familiar ice crystallize in her veins. The unknown aircraft weren't behaving like lost civilians or confused foreign pilots. Their formation was too precise, their approach too deliberate, their silence too complete. This felt like the opening moves of an engagement she'd witnessed before, in skis far from Nevada where the rules were simpler and the stakes more honest. She switched to the F-16 tactical frequency just as Lieutenant Kim's panicked voice filled the airwaves. "Viper lead, Phoenix. I've got missile launch indication. Multiple launches from bogies at our 12 o'clock." The young pilot's training was holding, but Reaper could hear the edge of terror creeping into her voice as she faced the reality that someone was actually trying to kill her. "All flights defend. Chaff flare notch right." Morrison's command was immediate and professional, but Reaper knew it might not be enough. The F-16s were caught at high altitude with nowhere to hide, silhouetted against the morning sky like targets in a shooting gallery. Their defensive maneuvers were textbook perfect, but textbooks were written by people who'd never felt the supersonic whisper of death passing close enough to touch. The first missiles missed, confused by electronic countermeasures and defensive maneuvering that turned the sky into a chaos of twisting vapor trails. But Reaper's experienced eye caught something the younger pilots missed. The attacking aircraft weren't pressing their advantage. They'd fired from maximum range, almost as if they wanted to be seen rather than achieve kills. This felt wrong, like a setup for something larger. "Control, this is Reaper. I'm reading multiple surface contacts in Sector 7 Alpha," she transmitted, her low-altitude position giving her a view of the desert floor that the high-flying F-16s couldn't match. Through the heat shimmer, she could see vehicles moving in coordinated patterns, dust clouds that spoke of military organization rather than random civilian traffic. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than an air-to-air engagement. The response from exercise control was sharp and immediate. "Reaper, maintain observer status. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." But the voice carried an undertone of panic that suggested even the controllers were realizing this exercise had spiraled beyond their ability to manage. Above her, the F-16s were fighting for their lives with skill and courage that would have made their instructors proud. But courage couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of aerial combat. They were outnumbered, caught in the wrong position, and facing an enemy who'd clearly planned this engagement with meticulous care. Reaper watched Blade's F-16 disappear in a ball of fire and aluminum as an enemy missile found its mark despite perfectly executed defensive maneuvers. The young pilot never had time to eject, never had time to understand that sometimes training wasn't enough, that sometimes the enemy got a vote in how the battle unfolded. His death was instantaneous and final, unmarked by drama or last words or any of the romantic nonsense that Hollywood attached to aerial combat. The sky above the Nevada desert had become a killing field, and the hunters had become the hunted. But below the chaos, skimming the deck like a predator scenting blood, Reaper was done being an observer. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon held 1,174 rounds of 30 depleted uranium projectiles, each one capable of turning enemy aircraft into falling debris. It was time to remind everyone why they called her the Reaper. The mathematics of aerial combat are written in blood and physics, equations that balance speed against maneuverability, altitude against vulnerability, aggression against survival. As Reaper watched the remaining F-16s twist through the sky above her, she performed calculations that had nothing to do with computers and everything to do with experience paid for in nightmares and survivor's guilt. Stryker's F-16 was trailing smoke, its pilot fighting to maintain control as hydraulic fluid sprayed from severed lines. Lieutenant Marcus Stryker Rodriguez had taken shrapnel from a proximity-fused missile that had detonated close enough to pepper his aircraft with fragments but not close enough to destroy him outright. His voice crackled through the radio with the forced calm of a man, refusing to acknowledge that he was probably going to die in the next 60 seconds. "Viper lead, Stryker. I've got multiple system failures and I'm losing altitude. Permission to break off an RTB." The request was professional, proper, and completely irrelevant to the tactical situation developing around them. The unknown aircraft weren't going to grant safe passage to damaged fighters, and everyone knew it. "Negative, Stryker. Stay in formation. We punch out together or not at all." Morrison's response carried the weight of command responsibility that had aged fighter pilots since the invention of military aviation. He couldn't abandon his wounded wingman, but neither could he sacrifice the flight to save one aircraft. The calculus was brutal and unforgiving. Reaper keyed her radio, knowing that her next words would violate every protocol in the book and probably end her career. "Viper lead, this is Reaper. I've got eyes on multiple surface contacts coordinating with the air threat. This is a complex ambush, and you're flying into the killing zone. Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd seen this pattern before, in different skis under different circumstances, but with the same deadly logic. Reaper, stay off this frequency. The response came not from Morrison but from exercise control, panicked voices in a bunker who were losing control of a situation that had never been within their power to control. But protocol was a luxury for peacetime, and peacetime had ended the moment those unknown aircraft crossed into restricted airspace. The A-10's radar warning receiver suddenly came alive, painting threat symbols across her heads-up display with electronic urgency. Someone on the ground had activated surface-to-air missile systems, creating an integrated air defense network that turned the entire exercise area into a kill box. The F-16s, focused on the aerial threat, were flying directly into a trap that would eliminate them with mechanical efficiency. All flights, this is Reaper. You've got SAM sites active in sectors 4 through 8. Recommend immediate egress, Vector 270, Angel's Deck. She was violating direct orders, breaking radio discipline, and probably ensuring her own court-martial. But the alternative was watching 4 young pilots die because bureaucrats valued paperwork more than lives. Morrison's response was immediate and grateful. Roger, Reaper. All flights, follow Viper lead, descending to Angels 5, emergency egress Vector 270. The F-16s dove toward the desert floor, trading altitude for speed, and hopping that distance would break the targeting solutions that held them in electronic crosshairs. But as they descended, the trap revealed its true complexity. The unknown aircraft above began their own descent, cutting off escape routes with precision that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of American tactics. Surface-to-air missiles launched from hidden positions, their contrails drawing deadly geometry against the desert sky as they reached toward the fleeing fighters. Reaper watched it all develop with the detached clarity that came with accepting death as a likely outcome. The F-16s were good pilots flying excellent aircraft, but they were facing a coordinated enemy who'd planned this engagement with professional skill. Without intervention, those pilots would be statistics within minutes, their deaths serving no purpose beyond demonstrating that courage couldn't overcome superior positioning and numbers. The A-10 Thunderbolt II had been designed for exactly this situation: low-altitude combat against superior numbers, survival in hostile airspace, delivery of devastating firepower where it was needed most. As she armed her weapons systems and prepared to climb toward the developing furball, Reaper felt the familiar calm that preceded violence. She'd been a passenger long enough. It was time to remind everyone why the A-10 was called the Warthog, and why some pilots earned their call signs in blood. The desert floor disappeared beneath her as she pulled back on the stick, trading her low-altitude sanctuary for the deadly sky above. Somewhere in the chaos ahead, young pilots were learning that war was nothing like the simulators. But they weren't learning it alone. Lieutenant Rodriguez felt his F-16 shudder as another system failed, the aircraft's fly-by-wire computers struggling to maintain control as hydraulic pressure dropped toward zero. The desert floor rushed up toward him at an alarming rate, close enough now to count individual cacti and rock formations that would become his grave if his ejection seat failed to function. His training screamed at him to punch out, to trust in the Martin Baker seat and accept capture rather than death, but something deeper kept his hands on the controls. Behind him, an enemy fighter closed for the kill, its pilot patient and professional as he lined up for a cannon shot that would end Rodriguez's war definitively. The F-16's radar warning receiver painted the approaching threat with electronic urgency, but damaged systems could only warn, not defend. He was moments away from becoming a fireball when salvation arrived from an impossible direction. Reaper's A-10 materialized out of the heat shimmer like something from a fever dream, its twin engines screaming as she pulled into a climbing turn that defied everything the laws of physics said about heavy aircraft and their limitations. The Warthog's GAU-8 Avenger cannon spoke once, a brief burst that sent 30 rounds through the air at 4,200 rounds per minute. The enemy fighter simply disintegrated, transformed from a sophisticated war machine into falling debris in the time it takes to blink. Striker, this is Reaper. You've got a hydraulic leak, possible flight control damage. Recommend immediate landing at nearest suitable field. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd seen everything and survived most of it. Rodriguez felt something like relief flood through him as he realized he wasn't alone anymore, that someone who understood combat had entered the fight. "Reaper, where the hell did you come from?" Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, mixing gratitude with confusion as he watched the scarred A-10 climb toward his altitude with impossible determination. The Warthog looked like something from a previous war, slower, uglier, less sophisticated than the sleek F-16s, but it moved with predatory purpose that spoke of serious intent. "I've been watching," Viper lead, "and what I've been watching is a setup." Reaper's response was matter-of-fact as she analyzed the tactical situation developing around them. Multiple ground sites, coordinated air defense, perfect timing on the ambush. Someone wanted to kill you specifically, and they've done their homework. The implications were staggering and immediate. This wasn't a random incursion or navigation error. Someone had planned an attack on American military personnel during a training exercise, using knowledge of flight patterns and communication procedures that could only have come from inside sources. The exercise had been compromised from the beginning, turning Red Flag 24-3 into a carefully orchestrated assassination attempt. Above them, the remaining unknown aircraft regrouped with mechanical precision, their pilots adjusting to the new variable that Reaper's intervention had introduced to their calculations. They'd planned for F-16s with predictable tactics and limited ground attack capability. They hadn't planned for an A-10 pilot who'd spent years turning enemy positions into smoking craters, and who approached air-to-air combat with the same methodical lethality she applied to everything else. "All flights, this is Reaper. Recommend defensive wheel, altitude 3,000, keep the fight over Sector 9. Her tactical suggestions carried the weight of experience, positioning the surviving aircraft over terrain that would favor their capabilities while limiting enemy options. The F-16s could use their superior speed and climb rate, while the A-10's low-altitude handling and devastating firepower would dominate anyone foolish enough to descend into the weeds. But as they maneuvered into position, Reaper caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. The ground contacts she'd spotted earlier were moving with purpose and coordination that suggested military training and equipment. Vehicle-mounted missiles were deploying from hidden positions, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the sky above Sector 9 into a killing field. The trap was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had realized, and at its center, 4 American pilots were about to discover that survival sometimes required breaking every rule in the book. Morrison's F-16 shuddered as proximity-fused warheads detonated close enough to pepper his aircraft with shrapnel that starred his canopy and sent warning lights cascading across his instrument panel. The enemy was pressing their attack now, closing the distance as they realized that prolonged engagement favored the Americans, who had superior individual pilot skills and more experience in chaotic combat situations. Viper lead, "I've got multiple missile launches from the deck. SAM sites are active in sectors 4, 6, and 8. Phoenix's voice carried new confidence as she adapted to the reality of combat with professional competence that would have impressed her instructors. She was flying her damaged F-16 with skill that bordered on artistry, using terrain masking and chaff dispensers to break targeting solutions while maintaining offensive capability. Reaper analyzed the developing situation with tactical clarity honed by years of combat experience. The enemy had positioned their ground-based assets to create kill zones that channeled the F-16s into predictable flight paths, but they'd made one critical error. They'd planned for a high-altitude engagement where surface-to-air missiles could dominate the battlefield. They hadn't considered what would happen when someone brought the fight down to the deck, where terrain became cover and visual identification replaced radar locks. "All flights follow me down. We're taking this fight to the weeds," she transmitted, pushing the A-10's nose toward the desert floor with authority that brooked no argument. The Warthog belonged at low altitude, where its titanium bathtub could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft, and where its cannon could reach out and touch people with decisive effect. The F-16s followed her down, their pilots trusting in the voice that had already saved their lives once. As they descended, the tactical picture changed dramatically. Ground-based radar systems lost track as the aircraft disappeared into the radar shadow created by terrain features. Surface-to-air missiles struggled to maintain locks on targets that appeared and disappeared behind mesa and canyon walls. The enemy's carefully planned kill box transformed into a chaotic knife fight, where individual skill and experience mattered more than numbers and positioning. But the cost of survival was becoming apparent as system failures mounted across all aircraft. Rodriguez's F-16 was leaving a trail of hydraulic fluid and smoke that would soon force him to eject or attempt a dead-stick landing in hostile territory. Phoenix's aircraft had taken damage to its radar system, reducing her to visual targeting in a fight where beyond visual range engagements were becoming the norm. Even Morrison's previously undamaged F-16 was showing signs of stress as his airframe absorbed punishment that it hadn't been designed to handle. Only Reaper's A-10 seemed unaffected by the violence surrounding them, its titanium armor shrugging off damage that would have been fatal to the sleeker fighters. The Warthog had been built for exactly this situation: close combat, heavy damage, survival in the worst possible conditions. As she lined up for another attack run, the cannon's targeting reticle centered on an enemy fighter with mechanical precision. The GAU-8 spoke again, sending a stream of depleted uranium projectiles through the air with devastating effect. The enemy fighter absorbed the hits and simply came apart, its pilot never knowing what had killed him as 30mm rounds designed to destroy Soviet tanks made short work of aircraft aluminum and flesh. But victory carried a price that was becoming clear to everyone in the fight. This engagement was escalating beyond anyone's ability to control, and somewhere in the distance, more enemy aircraft were approaching with reinforcements that would tip the numerical balance beyond recovery. The trap was closing, and escape was becoming a mathematical impossibility with each passing minute. The desert sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows as the battle entered its most dangerous phase. Soon, everyone would understand that some fights could only end one way, and that heroism was often just another word for accepting the unacceptable. The tactical situation deteriorated with mathematical precision as more enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon, their approach vectors coordinated to eliminate any possibility of escape. Reaper counted 12 new contacts, maintaining perfect formation discipline as they closed the distance at maximum cruise speed. Someone was taking this engagement seriously enough to commit significant resources, suggesting that the stakes were higher than anyone in the American formation fully understood. Magic, this is Viper lead. Request immediate backup, any available aircraft, Sector 9 Nevada test range. Morrison's transmission carried the controlled desperation of a leader watching his tactical options disappear with each passing minute. His F-16 was running low on both fuel and ammunition, and his remaining wingmen were in similar condition after nearly 30 minutes of high-intensity combat. The AWACS controller's response was not what anyone wanted to hear. Viper lead, Magic. No additional assets available for immediate deployment. Nearest backup is 40 minutes out. Recommend emergency egress if possible. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours given their current tactical situation. They would be dead or captured long before help could arrive. Reaper felt familiar ice settle in her stomach as she processed the implications. 4 aircraft against 16, in hostile airspace, with limited ammunition and fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving, but mathematics had never stopped her before. She'd faced worse odds in Afghanistan, where Taliban fighters had learned to fear the sound of A-10 engines and the distinctive growl of the GAU-8 cannon that meant death was coming from above. Viper lead, this is Reaper. I've got an idea, but it's going to require everyone to trust me completely. Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already accepted the likely outcome and was focused entirely on taking as many enemies with her as possible. The A-10's ammunition counter showed 847 rounds remaining, enough for perhaps 2 more engagement sequences before she'd be reduced to flying a very expensive observation platform. Rodriguez's F-16 was trailing more smoke now, its damaged engine struggling to maintain power as multiple systems failed in cascade. Reaper, Striker, I don't think I've got much time left. Whatever you're planning, better make it fast. His voice remained steady despite the knowledge that ejection over hostile territory would likely mean capture or death, neither of which appealed to a pilot who'd grown up reading stories about American POWs and their fate at enemy hands. The plan that formed in Reaper's mind was simple, direct, and almost certainly suicidal. But it was also the only option that offered any possibility of getting her people home alive. She'd used similar tactics in Afghanistan, turning the A-10's reputation for indestructibility into psychological weapons that were often more effective than actual ordnance. Fear was a force multiplier, and enemies who believed they were fighting something supernatural tended to make mistakes. All flights form up on me. We're going to convince these people that they've bitten off more than they can chew. She armed her remaining missiles and selected full automatic mode on the cannon, transforming the A-10 from a ground attack platform into something approaching a flying fortress. The Warthog's titanium armor could absorb damage that would destroy any other aircraft in the inventory, and its twin engines were positioned to provide maximum survivability even after multiple hits. As the enemy formation approached their maximum effective range, Reaper made a decision that would define the rest of her life, however long that might be. Instead of seeking defensive positions or attempting to break contact, she turned directly toward the approaching threats and,